Amy Klobuchar.
I was just floored. I had never seen the lunch counter. I saw parts of it at the Smithsonian, but I had never been there to visit, and it was a beautiful, beautiful moment. I'm sure you've all been there, and it's also great to be back here in Greensboro, which has happy and sad memories for me. Happy because one of the last times I saw Kay Hagan before she got sick was at her house. It was just a few months, and we had dinner with Kay and Chip. And then the next time I was back was for her funeral, which was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so anyway, I miss her very much. She was one of my best friends in the Senate, so it's good to be back in her honor, but also to meet these incredible leaders. And we just had a good discussion. Just so you know, my background, I have been doing a lot on voting rights since I got to the Senate. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and then I'm also the ranking Democrat, the highest ranking Democrat on the Rules Committee of the Senate, which should be passing a bunch of election law reforms right now, but it's been stymied, and the House actually moved on a number of the bills that I've put forward. And so they're sitting right now on Senator McConnell's desk, but they've been passed. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about, I'll note. And mostly, I thought it would be historic to have this discussion here in North Carolina because of the struggles that you've had here with voting rights, and also the history to be in a place like this and to see that lunch counter and think of those students who wouldn't give up and just kept coming back and back and back until the lunch counter was integrated. And that's how I feel about voting rights right now. We're just not going to give up. And that is everything from the voter ID challenges that I know have happened here to the gerrymandering, which I know there's been some change, but there's still gerrymandering going on, to what we're seeing across the country with voting purges, where people are basically kicked off the voting rolls. I mentioned it at the debate the other night, and actually got the idea of how to think about it in my head from Stacey Abrams, who would be the governor of Georgia right now, if there were some different voting measures put in place. But she said it like this. She said, if you don't go to church or mosque or synagogue for a year or so, you don't lose your right to worship. And if you don't go to a meeting like this, you don't lose your right to assemble. And just because you haven't voted for a few elections, you shouldn't lose your right to vote. And in states, when I tell this story at home and I explain how people get knocked off the voting rolls, well, Minnesota, which, okay, I'm not going to boast, but we have the highest voter turnout in the country, but I will. They say to me, okay, well, then when you just register when you get there on election day, because we have same-day registration in our state, as do some of the states that have the highest voter turnout, where if you're not registered, you can show up maybe with a neighbor or with proof from a gas bill or something like that of your residency, and you're able to register when you get there. Now, the voting laws still apply, and they probably check your name into a computer, but the point is it makes it really easy for people to vote, and it would help to eliminate some of this problem for these states that do the voting purges. So I actually have a federal bill to do that as well. You could do that on a national level. And probably my favorite thing, and then we'll turn to these incredible guests that we have here, but my favorite thing that we have is actually a bill to automatically register every kid to vote when they turn 18 in the country. And there's actually no reason that we shouldn't be able to do that, because Target can find a pair of shoes. I know this because they're my hometown company. They can find a pair of shoes in Hawaii with a SKU number, okay? So why couldn't we find a way to do this? We give people social security numbers, and you do it on the federal basis. So we should be able to do this when it comes to voting. Just a few other things I wanted to mention is just election security. With what we've seen with the president's own intelligence heads explaining how the Russians are getting bolder, and could be also other countries as well. And we worked really hard to try to put some safeguards in place with funding. I think North Carolina got $10 million off this funding that I worked on to help with bolstering election equipment. But right now, there's about a dozen states that don't have backup paper ballots throughout their state. For instance, the state of New Jersey has no backup paper ballots at all. And I'm not telling any secrets. Obviously, these countries know which states don't have backup paper ballots. So if there was a hack, as they tried to do in 50 states, there would be no proof of how people voted. And it could put a whole presidential race up in the air. So that's why Senator Lankford, who's a conservative Republican, and I joined forces and had a number of Republicans on the bill, including Senator Burr and Senator Lindsey Graham, as well as the Kamala Harris was on it, and Senator Warner, and we thought it was just going to fly through. It basically just said, if you get federal election money, then you've got to have backup paper ballots. But the White House made calls, and Mitch McConnell made calls, and they stopped the bill from going to the floor. So we never were able to pass that bill. That happened about a year ago. It's all documented, what happened in the news reports. So I'm obsessed with that because it's something that I think should have happened and had bipartisan support. And as president, it's something that I would get done. The other thing to mention is just social media. As we get into the election season here, we've tried really hard to try to have the same rules apply to social media companies that apply to TV and radio and newspaper, where you have to have those disclaimers saying who paid for it, at the end of all the ads, as well as keeping the ads on file so someone can see the ads, a campaign or the press or whatever. And we've also been unable to advance that bill despite it being a bipartisan bill. Senator McCain did that bill with me originally, and when we sadly lost him, Senator Graham's now doing it, but McConnell has not allowed that bill to advance either. And when you look at what that bill is, it's pretty straightforward. And if you think it doesn't matter, I'll just leave you with one discriminatory example of the kind of stuff we're going to see, and this is kids play compared to the doctored videos and the like. This was an image in the 2016 election. It wasn't a paid ad, but it was an image that went all over Facebook pages of African Americans in swing states. And we actually showed this image during a Judiciary Committee hearing, and I think the Washington Post had discovered a bunch of these ads and images that were put on. It was an innocent woman, African American woman from Chicago, and she actually called Senator Durbin's office later and said they just took my face. They put her picture on this image that went on people's pages. It had a fake Hillary Clinton logo, and it said a few weeks before the election, "Why wait in line to vote? You can text your vote for Hillary to 86153 or some number." Obviously false, obviously done to suppress the vote, obviously done to suppress African American votes. So that's what we're dealing with here, and it's really, really evil, and it's very important that people, when you see those images, that you at least try to report them, take screenshots of them, so that we can have some reckoning for what is going on. But the fact that there are still paid ads, Twitter doesn't accept them, Facebook is trying to archive them, but there's no rule across the board for these paid ads for the social media companies. And I bring that up because it's so relevant right now as we head into an election. So to me, it kind of comes into these three buckets. One is what I talked about first, which we should be making it easier to vote. we should have national reforms. The first bill I want to pass is H.R. 1, which has already passed the House, which is a collection of these things I mentioned on voting purges. The bill that I lead with Sherrod Brown on things like an independent commission for gerrymandering. And then the second thing is what I mentioned, which is the need to keep elections secure, and not just from criminal elements, but also to protect our right to vote from misleading information. And then the third thing is money in politics. And the only way you really get at that U.S. Supreme Court case, Citizens United, is by passing a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizen United, because it basically allows this flood of outside money to come into our politics, and individual candidates aren't accountable. I care a lot about this because I didn't come from a lot of money, and unlike some of the people running for president with major bank accounts, that's a euphemism out of Minnesota, I have to raise all the money. And I was joking the other day with people when I first ran for the U.S. Senate. I couldn't get anyone to call me back because my last name was so hard nationally. And one day I just gave up, and I started calling everyone I knew in my life. I looked through and just figured out who could help me. And that is when I set what is still an all-time U.S. Senate record. I raised $17,000 from ex-boyfriends. And as has been pointed out, it is by my husband. It is not an expanding base by any means. So anyway, so we're pretty excited, and I'm excited to have our guests here. Maybe we'll start with Anita Earls, who we're so honored to have you here from the North Carolina Supreme Court. And you must all be proud to have her on the court, as well as her background in civil rights and understanding these issues. And Derek Smith with North Carolina A&T University, thank you so much, who's an expert on these things. And then we also have Sydney right here, Sydney Batch, who is on the North Carolina House of Representatives, and knows all of will fill us in of the latest of what the legislature has been doing. And I know that Governor Cooper has been trying to be a bulwark against some of these discriminatory laws that people are trying to pass, and in some ways the courts have also stepped in. One of the quotes I always use wherever I am in the country, because it's so chilling, was the federal district court in North Carolina that said that the legislature, the majority in the legislature, which Sydney is not part of, was discriminating with surgical precision. That was a quote. That's not my quote. That was a quote from the court against African Americans in some of these voting laws that have been passed. So that's a great introduction to all of you, but maybe you want to start, Anita and Justice, and just talk a little bit about your perspective from the courts.
Well, really, I think what I bring is my perspective as a civil rights attorney and as a voting rights attorney. And so thank you so much for having me here and for having this event in such a meaningful place for all of us. And what I would say is, from my perspective of 30 years of litigating voting rights cases, the efforts to suppress the vote of African American voters in this state and in the South, but particularly in this state, they're not new, but they are continuing. So I think it's important that people realize that there really are efforts to try to counteract that. Democracy North Carolina, Southern Coalition for Social Justice, League of Women Voters, these are all nonpartisan, nonprofit groups that are working, even as we speak. There's a hotline up because we're in the early voting period. So if you do see any of the kinds of ads she's talking about, any kinds of efforts to suppress the vote, any kind of misinformation about the election, you can call the 188 Our Vote hotline. And there's attorneys on the other end of the phone to try to troubleshoot and problem solve for those problems. So we are very eager to protect the right to vote in the state, but also very aware of the challenges.
Exactly. Very good. Maybe Sydney?
So thank you very much for having me on the panel. It's an honor to be here. I am serving in my first term in the General Assembly right now in the North Carolina House in Southern Wake County. And one of the challenges that we see is that prior to me being elected in 2018, where we broke the supermajority, we saw, of course, in 2018, the passage of, by 55%, voters spoke and said, you know what, we want voter ID. And so we have a constitutional amendment that says, let's do this. We didn't take the time to, of course, propose enacting legislation with that. What they did was the Republican leadership said, we know that the supermajority has been broken. So instead of waiting to go ahead and address this enacting legislation, take the time to see what the effects would be with regards to what we should do for the enacting legislation that needs to accompany this new amendment. They decided to, in a lame duck session, push through legislation that was just struck down by our Court of Appeals. And so what you see is a picking and choosing of when it's convenient for the people in power to determine when they're going to pass legislation and whether it's going to be a negative effect to citizens of North Carolina. And so I wish that the General Assembly would focus more on passing legislation that is fair and equitable, and we would save a lot of tax dollars and a lot of time and headache from the courts and the appeals and the litigation that has ensued since, before 2013 when we got rid of straight ticket balloting that, of course, oftentimes is used by minorities. And so you see this undermining and eroding of democracy over several years in our state. And I believe that as legislators, it's incumbent upon us to, of course, pass legislation that's fair and equitable, not so that it's for political gain. And I think that's what we've unfortunately seen the majority in the General Assembly focus on in the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Derek?
Well, my perspective pretty much comes from three hats I wear. One as a professor at North Carolina A&T. The other other two are as an activist on the ground, working with the North Carolina NAACP and with the Poor People's Campaign. And I'm the political action chair for the Poor People's Campaign. And we've been fighting this battle against voter suppression since 2010 when the perfect storm came down. With the January, we had the Citizens United case was handed down by the Supreme Court. Republicans and American Legislative Exchange Council, Art Pope, groups, Red State, they all got together and came up with crafty methods in which to disenfranchise African Americans. And then today is the 2,438th day since Shelby versus Holder in 2013. The day after Shelby versus Holder was handed down, the North Carolina General Assembly passed House Bill 589, which is the most restrictive, suppressive voter legislation since 1965.
Mm-hmm. And just the Shelby v. Holder was the one that reversed struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act, which had sort of as a safety valve so that states couldn't enact things like this for certain states that had a history of discrimination. So.
Right, and that provision is called preclearance, along with a coverage formula which would trigger in states which had states and jurisdictions which had a history of voter discrimination on the basis of race, primarily. And when that was snatched out in 2013, it was then up to Congress to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act.
Which had always been bipartisan.
Right.
And then that didn't happen.
Right.
Then immediately you finish your story about North Carolina. Just wanted to, not everyone knows every court case.
And then immediately House Bill 589 is rolled out, which had a voter ID provision. It did away with same-day registration and voting. It didn't allow 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. It cut out a week of early voting. And this would eventually lead to the case that Senator Klobuchar mentioned, where the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals said that this was done with almost surgical precision and with racially discriminatory intent. So our perspective on the ground has also included the gerrymander of North Carolina A&T, which was is the largest HBCU in the nation. and it was split right down the middle. It was cracked into districts in 2016, and fortunately, due to a lot of activism on the ground by students and people around the state, and the courts, which are favorable to us at times, towards the end of last year, the Supreme Court, or the courts have ruled that gerrymander is unconstitutional, racial gerrymander.
So then what happened? So then they drew a new map, is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the map that this election is under that's coming up?
Yes. North Carolina A&T was split into 2 congressional districts, the 6th and the 13th. Now they're just in the 6th. And the 6th is open. The incumbent, Mark Walker, is no longer running. And there's a bunch of people out there. There's a bunch of folks out there vying for that position.
Okay. So, so the gerrymandering could be resolved if there's a bill that we have that would actually just require independent commissions, which a lot of states have in each state. And the U.S. Supreme Court has tended to strike down racial gerrymandering some, not as much partisan gerrymandering. And so that is why having these independent commissions would make it so much better. And I go at it from the my own state, which has that. So we have more contested elections, that is true. But yet, then it's more fair because you have more contested elections because they haven't put each district into, this one's all Republican and this one's this. And I think it's just a more fair way to pick the representatives. And then the voting, so what's happening with the voting rights, the amendment? So that was a constitutional amendment that passed here with the voter ID, right?
Right, exactly. But we didn't actually have any proposed legislation that was supposed to implement that amendment. So it's very quick to put on the ballot, and we
so
thought
that's what's delayed. That's why the courts have delayed it, so it's not in effect.
Exactly, and so they delayed it because they said that the legislation that was passed during that lame duck session was also targeted to go ahead and diminish minority votes and was discriminatory.
Right,
in that.
And so it would hurt. Talk about who it would hurt the most, do you think?
Certainly minorities, certainly people who are disabled, who are elderly, who don't have IDs. There are a lot of states in this throughout the country that have that voter ID has become more popular. I think 38 states may even have requirements for some type of form of ID, but they're very expansive in the sense that they allow for instance, public assistance cards. You can use your veteran card. You can use a debit card. I'm a member of state employees, so my face is on my card. However, the legislation that was passed in the lame duck session in 2018, right after the election, prevented the use of public assistance cards, which is oftentimes used by, which is more popular among minorities and among people who have a harder time taking time off of work, right? So the working poor. So you have a subset of individuals that they clearly knew that they were targeting to try and prevent them from being able to have access to the ballot box. And there are a lot of measures. The people have spoken. They want voter ID in the state, but that doesn't mean that you have to make it so restrictive that you prevent people from being able to go. So we just need to look at an expansive definition of if the entire purpose is to identify who you are at the ballot box, we should not require it to be so specific as saying that it has to be one form of ID with the federal government but not another. I think in the current opinion, one of the Judge Hampson said at the Court of Appeals that there was a specific provision that said, you know what, you can't use your government assistance card because it's federal and we don't have any regulations on what the feds would require. But you let
we don't trust them
because we don't trust them. But you let passports, or you let your veterans card, or you let your military ID, all of which are obviously government IDs, be used. So it's just a disingenuous argument. And when you are going into it with a negative intent and knowing that you're trying to disenfranchise a large group of voters that tend to not vote for you and with you, then you see it laid out from 2010 all the way through now. And so I think that one of the arguments in the opinion from the Court of Appeals is that we can't believe you and we can't take you at face value because we've seen all of the other iterations and the things that the General Assembly has done to try and undermine the votes for minorities.
Yeah, we had, when this was proposed in our state, it was a constitutional amendment. We don't have that many of those types of votes just because of how it's set up, and everyone thought it was going to pass. And then we actually, our Democratic governor joined forces with a former Republican governor, and they did joint ads about why it would be bad, and it was focused on bad for seniors, who didn't have IDs, that had voted forever, and that kind of argument. But that crossed that line in that they passed something. So the question is, how's it going to be implemented?